The sound of sirens pierced the summer afternoon like a knife through silk. Three police cruisers screeched to a halt outside Riverside Elementary's playground, their doors flying open as officers emerged with hands already reaching for their weapons. Children's laughter died instantly, replaced by the sharp commands of uniformed men who had arrived ready for war at what should have been a sanctuary of innocence. "Drop the weapon! Drop it now!" Officer Martinez's voice thundered across the playground, his service pistol drawn and aimed at a small figure near the monkey bars. The child froze, a bright, neon-green water gun clutched in his trembling hands, his dark eyes wide with terror that no 7-year-old should ever have to feel. 20 minutes earlier, Jamal Williams had been living in the blissful world that summer afternoons were meant to provide. The playground at Riverside Elementary buzzed with the joyful chaos of children released from the constraints of classroom walls. Swings creaked in rhythm, slides echoed with delighted squeals, and the air itself seemed to shimmer with possibility. Jamal's grandmother, Mrs. Evelyn Williams, sat on a bench under the shade of an old oak tree, her weathered hands holding a book she wasn't really reading. Instead, she watched her grandson with the kind of protective love that comes from raising 3 generations of children in a neighborhood where such love was both necessity and gift. At 68, she had seen enough to know that moments like these were precious, fragile things that could shatter without warning. "Grandma, look, I got Marcus. I got him good." Jamal's voice carried the pure joy of a child's victory as he chased his friend around the jungle gym, his new water gun gleaming in the afternoon sun. The toy was a birthday gift from his uncle, a Super Soaker Supreme in electric green and orange, the kind of weapon that waged war on summer heat and boredom with equal effectiveness. Marcus, 8 years old, and Jamal's partner in countless adventures, ducked behind the slide with his own water gun, a smaller blue model that nonetheless packed enough punch to soak anyone within range. "You missed me by a mile," he called out, his voice bright with laughter. "My turn." The two boys had been friends since they were toddlers, their mothers having bonded over sleepless nights and teething remedies in the same apartment complex. Their friendship was the kind that adults remembered wistfully, uncomplicated by the weight of the world that would eventually settle on their shoulders. They played with the abandon of children who still believed in heroes and happy endings, who saw water guns as instruments of summer magic rather than objects of fear. Mrs. Williams smiled as she watched them, remembering her own son playing on these same grounds 30 years ago. The playground had been renovated since then, the old metal equipment replaced with colorful plastic and rubber surfaces designed to soften falls. But the laughter was the same, the joy unchanged by time or circumstance. It was then that Karen Morrison arrived. Karen had moved to the neighborhood 6 months ago, drawn by the promise of good schools and rising property values. She was 42, divorced, and carried herself with the kind of defensive superiority that comes from feeling perpetually under siege by a world that didn't appreciate her particular brand of vigilance. Her blonde hair was styled in a precise bob that never moved in the wind, and her clothes were always pressed, always coordinated, always designed to project an image of someone who had everything under control. She had come to the playground with her daughter Emma, a quiet 10-year-old who seemed to carry the weight of her mother's anxieties in her thin shoulders. Emma had asked to play with the other children, but Karen had steered her toward the swings on the far side of the playground, away from what she called the rougher element. Karen's eyes had immediately fixed on Jamal and his water gun. She watched him play with the kind of intensity that most people reserved for watching wild animals, her jaw tightening with each joyful shout, each mock battle cry. To her, the bright green toy wasn't a child's plaything, but a threat, a danger that needed to be addressed before it could escalate into something worse. "Emma, come here," she called sharply, her voice cutting through the playground's happy noise. "We need to move to a different area." Emma looked up from the swing, confused. "But Mom, I just got here. Can I play a little longer?" "Not here. There's a child with a weapon. It's not safe." "No." Karen's voice carried the kind of certainty that brooked no argument. The tone of someone who had already decided that her version of reality was the only one that mattered. Emma's eyes followed her mother's gaze to where Jamal was hiding behind a tree, waiting to ambush Marcus with a stream of water. "Mom, that's just a water gun. We have one at home." "That's different. That's different entirely." Karen's voice had taken on the hard edge that Emma had learned to recognize as a warning sign. "You can't tell the difference anymore. These toys, they look too real. Someone could get hurt." But it wasn't the toy that concerned Karen, and somewhere in the honest corners of her mind, she knew it. It was the child holding it, the color of his skin, the way he moved with confidence and joy in a space that she had somehow decided should be hers to control. The water gun was just an excuse, a justification for the unease that had been building in her chest since the moment she saw him. Karen pulled out her phone with hands that trembled slightly, whether from anger or fear. She couldn't say. Her fingers hovered over the screen for a moment, the weight of what she was about to do settling into her consciousness like a stone dropping into still water. She could have approached Mrs. Williams directly, could have expressed her concerns like one parent to another. She could have simply left the playground and taken Emma elsewhere. Instead, she dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? The dispatcher's voice was calm, professional, trained to handle crises with efficiency and care. Yes, I'm at Riverside Elementary Playground, and there's a child here with a gun. He's threatening other children, waving it around. I think he's armed and dangerous. Karen's voice carried the breathless quality of someone reporting a genuine emergency. Her words chosen with the precision of someone who knew exactly what response they would provoke. Ma'am, can you describe the child? He's black. Maybe 7 or 8 years old. He's with another child. And they're pointing guns at people. It looks very real. Very threatening. I'm scared for the other children here. Are you certain it's a real weapon? Ma'am. Karen paused, watching Jamal as he emerged from behind the tree with his water gun raised, his face bright with the kind of innocent mischief that should have been impossible to mistake for malice. I can't tell the difference. These days, you never know. He's acting very aggressively, and I'm afraid someone's going to get hurt. The dispatcher's training kicked in, protocol overriding the small voice that might have asked more questions. Officers are being dispatched to your location. Please stay on the line and keep yourself safe. Karen hung up and grabbed Emma's hand, pulling her toward the parking lot. We're leaving. Now. But Mom, what about the playground I didn't get to play? There will be other playgrounds, safer ones. Karen's voice was tight, with the satisfaction of someone who had taken decisive action, who had protected her child from dangers that only she could see. As they drove away, Karen felt the righteous glow of someone who had done her civic duty. She had reported a potential threat, had called for help when she saw danger. The fact that the danger existed only in her imagination, fueled by fears and prejudices she would never admit to holding, was a truth that would remain buried beneath layers of justification and self-righteousness. Back at the playground, Jamal and Marcus continued their water war, oblivious to the storm that was heading their way. Mrs. Williams had noticed the woman with the phone, had seen her leave in a hurry, but she attributed it to the kind of overprotective parenting that seemed to be increasingly common these days. She had no way of knowing that in 5 minutes, her world would be turned upside down by the consequences of a stranger's fear. Grandma, Can we get ice cream after this? I'm getting really hot from all this running around. Jamal bounded over to the bench, his water gun slung over his shoulder like a soldier's rifle, his face flushed with exertion and joy. We'll see, baby. You and Marcus have been running around like wild things. Maybe it's time to calm down a little. Mrs. Williams reached out to smooth his hair, damp with sweat and playground dust. Just a few more minutes. Please, we're in the middle of the best battle ever. Mrs. Williams was about to answer when she heard the sirens. At first, she thought they were passing by, heading to some emergency elsewhere in the neighborhood. But the sound grew closer, louder, until it was impossible to ignore. Other parents and children stopped what they were doing, turning toward the street with the kind of curiosity that comes from living in a world where sirens are common background noise. The first police car appeared at the playground entrance, followed quickly by two more. Mrs. Williams felt her stomach drop as she watched uniformed officers emerge from their vehicles, their movements sharp and purposeful. She had lived long enough to know that when police arrived this quickly, this heavily armed, someone was in serious trouble. Drop the weapon. Drop it now. The command cut through the afternoon air like a blade, and Mrs. Williams felt the world shift around her as she realized the officers were looking at her grandson. Jamal stood frozen near the monkey bars, his water gun hanging from his small hands, his face a mask of confusion and terror. Jamal, drop the toy. Drop it right now. Mrs. Williams's voice cracked with fear as she rose from the bench, her hands raised instinctively, as if to shield her grandson from what was happening. Officer Martinez advanced with his weapon drawn, his training taking over as he assessed what he had been told was a threat. The dispatcher had reported an armed child, and the bright green object in the boy's hands looked real enough in the adrenaline-fueled moment. His finger rested on the trigger as he shouted again, "Drop the weapon and step away from the other children." Jamal's hands shook as he let the water gun fall to the ground, the plastic making a hollow sound as it hit the rubber surface. His eyes were wide with the kind of terror that would stay with him for the rest of his life. The moment when he learned that his skin color could make him a target, that his joy could be interpreted as a threat. "It's just a water gun," Marcus shouted from behind the slide, his own toy clutched in his hands. "We were just playing." Officer Thompson, younger and less experienced than his partner, swung his weapon toward Marcus, his training telling him to secure all potential threats. "You too, drop it and get on the ground." The playground erupted in chaos as other children began to scream and run. Parents rushed to gather their sons and daughters, their voices mixing with the officers' commands to create a symphony of fear and confusion. Mrs. Williams tried to move toward Jamal, but Officer Martinez blocked her path with his free hand. "Stay back, ma'am. We're handling a dangerous situation here." "That's my grandson. He's 7 years old. It's a toy." Mrs. Williams' voice carried the desperation of someone watching her worst nightmare unfold in real time. Jamal was on the ground now, his small body pressed against the rubber surface, his hands behind his head in a position that no child should ever have to learn. Officer Martinez approached cautiously, his weapon still drawn, and kicked the water gun away from the boy's reach. The toy spun across the playground, its bright colors catching the sunlight in a way that made its harmless nature impossible to deny. "It's a water gun," Officer Thompson said, his voice carrying the realization that they had just drawn weapons on a child with a toy. "Jesus Christ, it's a water gun!" The officers holstered their weapons, but the damage was done. Jamal lay on the ground, sobbing into the rubber surface, his small body shaking with trauma that would take years to heal. Mrs. Williams broke free from the officer's restraint and ran to her grandson, gathering him in her arms as if her love could somehow undo what had just happened. It's okay, baby. It's okay. Grandma's here. Her voice was soft, soothing, but her eyes blazed with an anger that burned like fire. She looked up at the officers, her gaze carrying the weight of generations of fear and pain. How dare you? How dare you treat a child like this? Officer Martinez looked down at the water gun, its neon colors suddenly seeming to mock the seriousness of their response. We received a call about an armed child. We were told he was threatening other children. By who? Who called you? Mrs. Williams' voice was sharp with accusation. We can't disclose that information, ma'am. But we had to respond to the call. Around them, the playground had emptied as parents hurried their children away from the scene. Those who remained watched with the kind of horrified fascination that comes from witnessing something that shouldn't happen in a civilized society. Some pulled out their phones, recording the aftermath of a police response that had gone terribly wrong. Marcus's mother, Teresa, arrived at the playground just as the officers were beginning to write their report. She had been at the grocery store when her phone rang with a call from a neighbor who had seen the police cars. She ran the 3 blocks to the playground, her heart hammering in her chest as she imagined all the terrible things that could have happened to her son. Marcus, where are you? Her voice carried the panic of every parent's nightmare. I'm here. Mom, I'm okay. Marcus emerged from behind the slide, his water gun forgotten on the ground, his face pale with shock. Teresa gathered her son in her arms, her eyes taking in the scene, the police cars, the officers. Jamal still clinging to his grandmother, the abandoned water guns that had somehow become the center of a crisis. What happened here? They thought our water guns were real, Marcus said, his voice small and confused. They made Jamal get on the ground like he was a bad guy. Teresa looked at the officers, her expression hardening as she understood what had occurred. You drew weapons on children, on babies playing with toys. Officer Martinez shifted uncomfortably under her gaze. We were responding to a call about armed children. We had to take it seriously. Armed children. They're 7 and 8 years old. Look at these toys. Teresa picked up Marcus's water gun, its bright blue plastic obviously harmless. How does this look like a real weapon to anyone? The officers had no answer that would satisfy the growing crowd of angry parents and concerned neighbors. Their training had taught them to respond to threats, but it had failed to prepare them for the reality of childhood play in a world where fear often overrode common sense. As the officers finished their report and prepared to leave, one of the bystanders approached Mrs. Williams. Her name was Sarah Chen, a local journalist who had been walking her dog when she heard the commotion. She had arrived in time to witness the aftermath and had recorded part of the incident on her phone. Mrs. Williams, I'm Sarah Chen from the Riverside Tribune. I saw what happened here, and I think people need to know about it. Would you be willing to talk to me? Mrs. Williams looked down at Jamal, who had finally stopped crying, but still clung to her with the desperation of someone who had just learned that the world was more dangerous than he had ever imagined. I need to get my grandson home. He needs to feel safe. I understand. But what happened here today? It's not right. Someone called the police on a child with a toy, and officers responded with weapons drawn. People need to know that this is happening in our community. Mrs. Williams considered the journalist's words, her mind already racing ahead to the implications of what had occurred. She had lived through the civil rights movement, had watched as her community fought for basic recognition of their humanity. She had hoped that her grandson would grow up in a world where such fights were no longer necessary. Give me your card. I'll call you tonight after I've had time to think about this. Right now, I need to take care of my baby. Sarah handed her a business card, her expression serious. Mrs. Williams, I want you to know that I have video of what happened here. The officers had their weapons drawn on a child with a toy. If you decide to speak out, you won't be alone." As Mrs. Williams walked home with Jamal, her mind was already working through the possibilities. She could stay quiet, could try to help her grandson forget what had happened, could pretend that it was an isolated incident that wouldn't happen again. Or she could speak out, could use her voice to ensure that no other child would have to experience what Jamal had endured. That evening, after Jamal had been fed and bathed and tucked into bed with extra hugs and reassurances, Mrs. Williams sat at her kitchen table with Sarah Chen's business card in front of her. She thought about her grandson's face when the officers had drawn their weapons, the terror in his eyes when he realized that his joy had been interpreted as a threat. She picked up the phone and dialed. "Sarah, this is Evelyn Williams. I've been thinking about what you said, and I want to tell my story." The article appeared in the Riverside Tribune the next morning, accompanied by Sarah's video and a photograph of the bright green water gun that had been mistaken for a deadly weapon. The headline read, "Police draw weapons on 7-year-old boy with water gun after anonymous 911 call." The story spread quickly through social media, picked up by larger news outlets, and shared by parents who recognized the horror of what had occurred. The video of officers with weapons drawn on a child became a symbol of everything that was wrong with a society that could see danger in a child's laughter. By noon, the story had been shared thousands of times. By evening, it was trending on national news. The bright green water gun that had started as a birthday gift had become a symbol of racial profiling, of fear winning over common sense, of a system that failed to protect the most vulnerable among us. Karen Morrison watched the news coverage from her living room, her face pale as she recognized the playground, the water gun, the child she had reported as armed and dangerous. The reporters didn't mention her name, but she knew that wouldn't last. In a town the size of Riverside, secrets had a way of surfacing, and the truth of who had made that 911 call would eventually come to light. "Mom, isn't that the boy from the playground? The one with the water gun?" Emma sat on the couch next to her mother, her young face troubled as she watched the news report. "Yes, honey, that's him." Karen's voice was barely above a whisper. "But Mom, you said he was dangerous. He was just playing." Karen looked at her daughter, seeing the confusion in her eyes, the dawning realization that her mother had been wrong about something fundamental. I was scared. I thought it was a real gun. But it was bright green and orange. Mom, our water guns at home look just like that." Karen had no answer for her daughter's logic, no way to explain the fear that had driven her to see danger where none existed. She watched as the news report showed interviews with other parents from the playground, their voices filled with outrage and disbelief. "That child could have been killed," one mother said, her voice shaking with emotion. "Someone called the police on a baby with a toy, and officers showed up ready to shoot. How is that acceptable in any civilized society?" The story continued to grow over the following days, with civil rights organizations calling for investigations and community leaders demanding answers. The police department issued a statement defending their officers' actions, while acknowledging that the situation could have been handled differently. "Our officers responded to a call about an armed individual," Police Chief Robert Harrison told reporters. "When faced with what appeared to be a weapon, they followed protocol. We're grateful that no one was hurt, and we're reviewing our procedures to ensure better outcomes in the future." But the community wasn't satisfied with bureaucratic responses and promises of review. Parents organized protests. Teachers spoke out about the trauma inflicted on their students, and local businesses began displaying signs supporting the affected families. Mrs. Williams found herself at the center of a movement she hadn't asked to lead. Her phone rang constantly with requests for interviews, with offers of support, with messages from other families who had experienced similar incidents. She was both grateful for the support and overwhelmed by the responsibility that came with speaking for those who had been silenced. A week after the incident, the truth about the 911 call began to emerge. Security footage from nearby businesses showed Karen Morrison's car leaving the playground just minutes before the police arrived. Phone records confirmed that the call had come from her number. The anonymous caller, who had set the entire tragedy in motion, was no longer anonymous. The revelation sent shockwaves through the community. Karen Morrison, a newer resident who had positioned herself as a concerned parent, had been exposed as the source of the false report that had traumatized a child and torn apart a community's sense of safety. The backlash was swift and severe. Karen's employer, a local insurance company, received hundreds of calls demanding her termination. Her daughter's school was flooded with complaints from parents who didn't want their children exposed to the prejudice that had led to such a catastrophic mistake. Karen tried to defend herself in a statement released through a lawyer, claiming that she had been genuinely concerned about public safety and had acted in good faith. But the explanation fell flat in the face of video evidence that showed Jamal playing innocently with a clearly toy weapon. "I saw what I believed to be a dangerous situation." Her statement read, "I called authorities out of concern for the safety of all children at the playground. I deeply regret that this situation escalated as it did." But the community saw through the carefully worded apology. They recognized the fear and prejudice that had driven Karen to see danger in a child's play, to interpret joy as a threat, to call armed officers to confront a 7-year-old boy with a toy. The protests that followed were both powerful and peaceful. Hundreds of community members gathered at the playground where the incident had occurred, carrying signs that read, "Children are not threats," and "Water guns are not weapons." They held a moment of silence for all the children who had been traumatized by adult fear and prejudice. Mrs. Williams spoke at the rally, her voice carrying the weight of generations of struggle and the hope of a better future. "My grandson was playing, just playing like children have done for generations, but someone looked at him and saw danger instead of joy. Someone looked at his beautiful brown skin and decided he was a threat." Her words resonated through the crowd, carried by local media to a national audience that was hungry for stories of justice and accountability. The incident at Riverside Elementary had become a symbol of larger issues, a microcosm of the struggles that communities across the country were facing. "But we're not going to let fear win," Mrs. Williams continued. "We're going to fight for a world where children can play without being seen as threats, where joy is recognized as joy, where the color of a child's skin doesn't determine how they're treated by the adults who are supposed to protect them." The legal consequences for Karen Morrison began to unfold as the district attorney's office announced that they were reviewing the case for potential charges. Filing a false police report was a crime, and doing so in a way that endangered a child carried additional penalties. "We take false reports very seriously," District Attorney Maria Rodriguez told reporters. "When someone calls 911 and reports a dangerous situation that doesn't exist, they waste public resources and put innocent people at risk. In this case, a child was traumatized because of a false report." The Williams family also filed a civil lawsuit against Karen Morrison, seeking damages for the trauma inflicted on Jamal and the disruption to their family's life. The lawsuit alleged that Morrison had acted with racial bias and had knowingly filed a false report that endangered a child. No child should have to experience what Jamal went through. The family's attorney, David Thompson, explained, "This lawsuit is about accountability, about making sure that people understand there are consequences for actions that harm children." As the legal proceedings moved forward, the community began to heal and organize. The incident had been a wake-up call, a reminder that vigilance against prejudice and fear was a constant necessity. Parents organized workshops on bias recognition. Schools implemented new curricula about diversity and inclusion, and community leaders worked to build bridges between different groups. The police department, under pressure from the community and facing potential federal investigation, announced sweeping reforms to their training and response protocols. Officers would receive additional training on implicit bias and de-escalation techniques, and new policies would require supervisors to review calls involving children before officers were dispatched with weapons. We recognize that we failed this community and this child, Chief Harrison admitted at a town hall meeting. We're committed to doing better, to training our officers to see children as children, not as threats. The changes weren't enough for everyone, but they represented a beginning, a recognition that the system that had failed Jamal needed to be reformed from the ground up. 3 months after the incident, Karen Morrison pleaded guilty to filing a false police report and was sentenced to community service and probation. The civil lawsuit was settled out of court for an undisclosed amount, with the money going into a trust fund for Jamal's education and therapy. More importantly, the incident had sparked a broader conversation about race, fear, and the treatment of children in American society. The video of officers with weapons drawn on a child became part of training materials for police departments across the country, a reminder of what could happen when fear overrode common sense. Jamal, with the help of therapy and the support of his community, began to heal from the trauma of that day. He still played with water guns, though he was more cautious now, more aware of how his actions might be interpreted by adults who didn't know him. I learned that some people are scared of me, he told his therapist during one session. But I'm not scary. I'm just a kid. The simplicity of his words carried a profound truth that the adults around him were still learning to understand. He was just a kid, a child who deserved to play without fear, to laugh without suspicion, to exist without being seen as a threat. The playground at Riverside Elementary was reopened with new rules and new hope. Signs were posted, reminding visitors that children of all backgrounds were welcome, that play was sacred, and that fear had no place in spaces designed for joy. Mrs. Williams continued to visit the playground with Jamal, though she was more vigilant now, more aware of the eyes that might be watching, the minds that might be judging. But she refused to let fear win, refused to let her grandson's joy be diminished by the prejudice of others. "Grandma, can we play war again?" Jamal asked one afternoon, his water gun in hand, his face bright with hope. "Of course, baby. You play as much as you want. This is your playground too." The sound of children's laughter filled the air once again, a testament to the resilience of joy in the face of fear, to the power of community in the face of prejudice, to the possibility of healing in the face of trauma. The incident at Riverside Elementary had ended, but its lessons lived on in a community that had learned to see children as children, to recognize joy as joy, and to understand that safety came not from fear and suspicion, but from love and acceptance. The bright green water gun that had started it all was eventually donated to a museum exhibit on civil rights and childhood, a reminder of how far the community had come and how much work remained to be done. But on that playground, in that moment, with children playing and laughing under the summer sun, it was possible to believe that progress was real, that healing was possible, and that joy would always find a way to overcome fear. The legacy of that day would live on in policy changes, in training programs, in the raised consciousness of a community that had learned to see its children through eyes of love rather than fear. And in the laughter of a 7-year-old boy who had survived an ordeal that no child should face and emerged with his spirit intact, there was hope for a future where all children could play without fear. where joy was recognized as the precious gift it was, and where the playground truly belonged to everyone. Years later, when Jamal was older and able to understand the full significance of what had happened to him, he would look back on that day as a turning point, not just in his own life, but in the life of his community. The trauma had been real. The fear had been overwhelming. But the response had been powerful. The healing had been genuine. And the changes had been lasting. The playground at Riverside Elementary had become a symbol of hope, a place where children of all backgrounds could play together without fear, where joy was celebrated rather than criminalized, where the community had learned to see its children through eyes of love rather than suspicion. And in the end, that was perhaps the most important lesson of all, that even in the darkest moments, when fear seemed to win, when prejudice seemed to rule, when children were seen as threats rather than treasures, the light of community love and determination could still break through, creating change that would protect future generations from the trauma that no child should ever have to endure. The water gun battle had ended, but the war for justice, for understanding, for the right of all children to play without fear, continued. And in that continuing struggle, there was both challenge and hope, both work to be done and progress to be celebrated. The playground belonged to everyone now, and the laughter of children playing under the summer sun was the sweetest sound of victory that any community could hope to hear.